Okay, good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Jaroslav. I'm Czech, but I currently am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bergen in Norway. And I'm a computer game historian. And yeah, computer games are old enough to have historians now. And I'm happy to be here in Katowice for many reasons. One of them is that a lot of the things that I'll be talking about are or could have been quite similar in Poland to what they were like in Czechoslovakia. Me and my wife went to the Museum of Silesia yesterday, and it's very impressive, and we could learn some kind of more about the history of the region and of Poland in general. Also, I like to be at this conference because I think it's a very forward-thinking conference, talking about innovation and positive change, but also having time to reflect. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk a bit about history. And so, as I said, I'm a computer game historian and currently finishing this book called Gaming the Iron Curtain, which should come out next year. And this has been a project of mine for a long time. And it's basically history of games behind the Iron Curtain in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. And back when I started doing this about 10 years ago, me and my colleagues from different parts of the world were a bit discontent about the state of computer game history. So most of the time, at that time, when you wanted to read something about computer game history, it was just a chronological, linear account of a succession of hardware platforms, or just kind of some hit games, just these big hits. And I don't really think you need a historian to tell you that PlayStation 3 came after PlayStation 2. So we wanted to take a different approach to game history, and so one issue was the focus on hardware, and the other issue was the focus on winners. So if you look at these charts of computer game history, most of the time it concerns stuff that was made in the USA or in Japan, not so much Poland or Germany or France or any other regions. So you probably all know Pac-Man, but who of you knows Bushka Pandora? Is there anybody? Okay, perfect. There are some people who know this game, which is amazing, but probably not enough. So that's a game that was probably the first commercially released game in Poland in 1986, and this tends to be forgotten, and that's why the history that I want to tell is two things. First, it's social. So me and my colleagues are not really that interested in the things themselves, although they're valuable and amazing, great artifacts. But we're more interested in the stories behind them, in the people who made them, and the social context in which they were working. And we also want to write histories that are local, focusing on a nation or a region or a place, and you'll see that place takes an important role in this research. Sorry about that. And when we think of games of the 1980s, I think that we tend to think of them as quite simple and maybe outdated, but I want to show that many of them were actually much more open-minded and experimental that we might think, that people were being very creative. And I want to talk about the use of games and digital media in general for creativity, activism, and I want to talk about how these people who made games in the 1980s might have been more indie and experimental and avant-garde that we might think. So let me say a few things about my method. So I've been working on this project on and off, but mostly on for 10 years, and I've been flipping through pages of old notebooks and computer club newsletters and old magazines, and I also did a lot of interviews. I made a point of talking to all the people in person. So it also involved a lot of traveling, around the country, around the Czech Republic, mostly, and Slovakia. And the closest I have been to Katowice, was in Ostrava, on the Czech side of Silesia. And this is my interviewee from Ostrava, Vlastimil Veselý, who's quite a character. In the 1980s, he was making games for 8-bit computers. He keeps making games for 8-bit computers today. And in the 1980s, he was a technician in the tram technician in the public transport company in Ostrava, and he still keeps doing the same thing. So he's a living piece of history and a great character. I also collaborated with documentary filmmakers. So as I'm finishing the book, a colleague of mine is finishing a documentary film on the same topic, and this is actually a still from the film, and you will see a bit of the film later. So I said that I want to compare what was happening in the 1980s with some of the more recent developments. And I'm sure most of you or all of you are familiar with the terms that I'll be using, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So one of the terms that's being used today to describe games that are somewhat different from the standard commercial game is indie. Indie games as an independent. It's a pretty vague term, but people have tried to define it. And I'm borrowing from a paper about indie games called "Is Every Indie Game Independent?" Towards the Concept of Independent Game. And I'm mentioning this because it was written by my Polish friends Maria Garda and Paweł Grabarczyk from WUD. So they're looking at indie games, independent game studios that are in existence now, and they basically say that there are kind of these three ways of looking at being independent. So one, they are financially independent, meaning that there's no big capital, investing a lot of money into the games. So that makes them indie. They're creatively independent, so nobody is telling them what to do. And there's a small team, and they have their own ideas. They usually work from their own aesthetic preferences, or their game genre preferences, or their thematic preferences. And also, they say, Maria and Paweł say that they have a particular indie style, which means that they're probably using pixelated graphics, which became this marker of indie games. Some of them might be text-based, twine games, text adventures, and so on, that are becoming popular on the indie scene, and so on. So these are some of the basic features of indie games as they are understood today. One thing that kind of strikes me as maybe not that great about this discussion of indie games is that they're always kind of opposed to something. So independent means not commercial in a way. It's a means of differentiating one subset of games from other games. And one of the things I want to show today is that this actually is not true historically, because indie games had always been there. They had been around before commercial games. And that by making indie games and experimental games, we're actually returning from the roots. We're not creating an alternative. We're just returning to something. And this argument was made famously by Anthropy, who's a video game designer, experimental video game designer, and a writer. And Anthropy wrote this book with a very long name, Rise of the Video Game Zine Sisters, How Freaks, Normals, Amateurs, Artists, Dreamers, Dropouts, Queers, Housewives, and People Like You are taken back an art form. And in this book, she listed these things that you can write games about. And I want to read that out because we'll get back to it. So you can make games about, not only about orcs and elves, but also about your dog, your cat, your child, your boyfriend, your friends, your imaginary friends, your summer vacation, your winter in the mountains, your childhood home, your current home, your future home, and she goes on. And this list is like 5 pages long. It's a whole chapter of the book. Basically, the argument she's trying to make is that there are so many things that we can make games about, but we're almost always kind of thinking very narrowly about fantasy and science fiction themed games. She also went out of her way to demonstrate this approach. Probably her most famous game is Dysphoria, which is a very simple but very sophisticated, mechanically simple and graphically simple, but very thematically, intellectually sophisticated game about her experience of sex change and hormonal therapy. So basically, becoming a woman. So it's a very personal game, very autobiographical game. Now I want to go back to, I want to focus on this one particular phrase from the title of the book, taking back an art form. I've already mentioned that, I don't really 100% agree with the fact that we're kind of creating an alternative. And she makes this argument that, games had been something else. That's also something that I want to say. And when she's looking back and looking for this sort of idealized, kind of romanticized past, she might be referring to the game ZZT, and she actually wrote a book about that game. I can't really describe it in detail, but it was this game from the early 90s that was very modular, included an editor, and the players could do all kinds of things in the engine of the game. And it was a game that was not sold commercially, but was distributed as shareware, which was a bit of a different model. So this is what she finds, this is what she thinks of as like the old golden age of game design. But we can go even further back in history. So there are these, very influential games like Moonlander. It has many different titles. Also, Lunar Landing. It's a sort of this strategy game about landing your spaceship on the surface of the moon. And that's a very influential title that was made in 1969 by a high school student, and it was never sold for money. Another one, even more influential, Adventure from 1975, written basically by two students who worked at universities. And they made this game on a mainframe, on a big computer. And this is probably the first narrative game. Basically, in this game, you enter the cave, and then some kind of magical things happen in the cave. It was inspired also by fantasy literature, but also by personal experiences of one of the authors, who was a speleologist, and it was his hobby to go into caves. It's a text adventure, and I'll be talking about text adventures quite a bit. Have you played any text adventures in your life? So some of you have, but probably not many. Basically, the idea of a text adventure is that the computer lists a description of a place that you are in, and then you type a command for your avatar, and then the avatar executes that command. So you can say, pick up axe, for instance, and if there's an axe at the place where you are currently, your character will pick up an axe, and this is how you communicate with the character. And this game was also never sold commercially. It was basically open source. One of the authors made the first version, and the other one improved on it, and then it spread among people. And this kind of brings me in a roundabout way to the context that I will be talking about, Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. So it wasn't easy to be a computer or gaming fan in the 1980s Czechoslovakia, and it was similar in Poland. Czechoslovakia was a very paradoxical country. On the one hand, it was heavily industrialized, so there was a lot of production of machinery, all kinds of things. It also had pretty good levels of education, especially in technical fields like mathematics and physics and so on. But at the same time, it had one of the most conservative, backwards-looking, and just old political elites. It was an undemocratic country controlled by the Communist Party, and the people who were in charge were just a bunch of old people who were very much out of touch with what ordinary people were thinking or hoping for or trying to do, and with kind of little knowledge of the technological developments. So it was a country that was somehow divided from the West by the so-called Iron Curtain. That meant that it was difficult to exchange knowledge and products with the West. It was possible, but it was very hard. So for instance, to get a computer, you wouldn't usually go to a shop or a store, but you would have to kind of travel to the West and bring in a computer. And to do that, you would have to have a special permit to travel to the West, which was not easy to get. Not everybody could get it. So it was a bit difficult. And I think that this makes Czechoslovakia an interesting laboratory, like an experimental space where we can see what would happen if games didn't become this sort of commercial force that they did in the West. There was no software or hardware market, pretty much, in Czechoslovakia. Things were a bit similar in Poland. As far as I know, it was more open and more liberal in Poland. And you could even go to these like street markets where you could buy games or computers. In Czechoslovakia, it wasn't like that. The computers that we did produce were just poorer clones, poor quality clones of the Western machines. So these are some of Czechoslovak computers from the 1980s. IQ 151, which the name probably means that it's a smart computer, and the Ph.D. 85. You can see they're kind of bulky, and people like them now as like kind of objects of this retro fetish. But they're just not pretty to look at. I think in Poland, Meritum was probably like was something similar to these. When you wanted a computer, you had to either wait in line in these specialized stores with imported goods, Tuzex in Czechoslovakia, Pevex, I believe, in Poland, or you could have somebody travel to the West and bring it to you, or smuggle it into the country most of the time, because you would also have to pay customs fees, which were very high. But nonetheless, tens of thousands of people worked with computers. And there was this infrastructure of computer clubs, which was actually supported by the state. So once again, then there's this interesting paradox. So on the one hand, the country was technologically very backward. And there was not that much going on in hardware or software. But at the same time, there was this belief that technology is the future. But we just weren't there yet. So there was a lot of support for for youth clubs that had to do with programming and working on computers, often working on computers that were smuggled into the country illegally. But anyway, it was supported by the state. So here's one of the clubs. You can see the student František Fuka showing his friends at the station of Young Technicians, which was the name of the club, his own new creation, a computer game. So that was quite an achievement, having made a computer game. Also, what you cannot see in this picture is women. And unfortunately, this was mostly a male endeavor in the 1980s. So, there were these stereotypes of, what hobbies are suitable for, for which gender. So unfortunately, very few women were involved. We also, in Czechoslovakia, didn't have any magazines. But that didn't stop us from reading Polish magazines. So Bytek was quite popular among Czechoslovak hobbyists. They kind of learned to read Polish, and they queued up at the Polish Cultural Center in Prague to get copies of Bytek. It was a very precious, artifact, having a Bytek. So then, you would kind of lend it to other people and copy it, and so on. So in Czechoslovakia, for different reasons, and I'll list one. The most popular computer, or digital, 8-bit computer platform, was the Sinclair's ZX Spectrum, which is a British computer. There are some of the reasons include the fact that it was the cheapest one that was on the market in the West. Another reason is that it was small enough to be easy to smuggle. So there are these apocryphal stories, maybe real, I'm not sure, of people kind of smuggling them in chocolate boxes or in lunch boxes, together with bread and cheese, so that the customs police don't find it, and so on. So most people actually had Western computers. This was the most popular computer there. And they were mostly also playing Western games that arrived in the country, into the country on cassette tapes from other countries. Most of the games that people were playing were made in the UK, but they made their way into the country usually through Poland or through Yugoslavia. Here are some of the popular games. Manic Miner on the top right was like immensely popular game in the around mid 80s, and people were even trying to make versions of this game for the domestic models, for the IQ 151 and so on that I showed to you. Yeah, this was the medium. This was the medium for digital files back then. There was this pretty efficient informal distribution system. There was no internet back then, so people had to sort of carry the tapes physically from one place to another and make copies for friends. But it was very efficient. Like in the late 80s, it would take about 1 to 2 weeks for a piece of software to get from one end of the country to the other. I mean, it's not a big country, but still, it was a pretty efficient system, emergent system of distribution. In the clubs, people were, we saw that they were trying to make their own games. There was this belief, not only by the kids but also by the authorities, that it is important to teach people, to teach kids how to program, and what's the best entryway into programming than trying to make your own game. So what were people trying to make? They were trying to mimic Western games, so kind of trying to make games that looked like Western games. And there were quite a few of these, like on the top left and on the bottom right, you can see these kind of shooters, science fiction games that were trying to actually hide the fact that they were made in Czechoslovakia. There was no word in Czech in those games. These people were just trying to show, I'm as good as the English programmers. I can do the same thing. So a lot of it was this showmanship, trying to show off. There were some conversions. Yeah, the one on the top right is a conversion of Manic Miner. There were also some adaptations of non-digital games that were kind of indigenous to the region, and one of them is Piškvorky. And maybe I could ask you a question. So, what kind of tic-tac-toe do you play in Poland? What does it look like? 3x3. Okay, that's interesting, because in Bohemia and the Czech Republic, probably in Slovakia too, we play something called Piškvorky, and it's very similar, but it's open world. So you played on a grid, but the grid is potentially infinite. You're basically just limited by the amount of squares that you have. So we used to play it in elementary school, on graph paper, on squared paper, and like you can go as far as the paper goes, basically. So I mean, yeah, probably somebody from the UK wouldn't make a computer game Piškvorky, but somebody from Prague actually did that. So these are some categories of games. But actually, most of the games that were created in the country were text adventure games. And I told you what a text adventure game looks like, and now a bit about the topics. So these were all amateur productions. They were not made to be sold commercially. So what they did was making games basically for themselves and their friends. This is a quote from one of the creators of the games. We were writing things that made sense to us and that also made sense to our audience, the friends around us. This might have included text adventures about Indiana Jones. So this is probably one of the, the graphics are quite poor. It's actually made by the guy who was on the picture, František Fuka. So Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom from 1985. I mean, this is obviously an unlicensed product, and George Lucas probably doesn't know it exists. Indiana Jones was a very popular fictional character. The Indiana Jones films were being screened in the country, although with some kind of delay of like 2 or 3 years usually. So Indiana Jones was something that young people cared about. This is the first game made in Czech about Indiana Jones, and we'll see Indiana Jones a bit further on. Yeah, this is, I'm including translations into English, but you might be able to work out the Czech probably as well. So now let's go back to what makes sense to us and our friends. Actually, quite a lot of the games that were being made in the 1980s in Czechoslovakia were autobiographical. They were about the people who made them. So almost all these topics that Anthropy suggested were actually being used in Czechoslovak games in the 1980s. And I don't know what's happening. I want to talk about two interesting categories of games, and hyperlocal games and then sort of activist political games. But first, hyperlocal games. I talked about the importance of place, and I have found many games that share these characteristics. Games created by people from a particular place, about that place, and about the people who inhabit that place, written mainly but not exclusively for the local community. It's a play on hyperlocal media, which was a big buzzword like, I don't know, 6 years ago, I think. It kind of petered out, but I think it's still a pretty useful way of thinking about media and amateur content, maybe user-generated content. One of the first ones was called Demon in Danger. It was made by Martin Malý, who lived in the village of Chleby, close to Prague. And this is the intro of the game. So this is what the player, the backstory that the player reads when the game starts. On November 13th, 1988, a strange person appeared in the village of Chleby. He was wearing an army uniform and a military hat. Those who know games for the Spectrum would recognize him as Dan Dare, a comics hero. He was an agent of the studio Fuchsoft, constructed by František Fuka. So here you can see that they're kind of trading these references with each other. So basically, referencing other creators from Czechoslovakia. His mission is to plant a bomb into the apartment of the competing studio Demon, that is, into the apartment of Martin Malý. So in this game, the player who plays one of Martin Malý's schoolmates enters the apartment of the Malý family and tries to defuse a bomb that was planted there. And it's a pretty fun game. I mean, it's quite simple, but what is most intriguing about it is, I think, the fact that you really can enter an apartment, in the 1980s. It's this like really interesting voyeuristic experience of just entering an apartment in that era. It takes place in this building that is still there in Chleby, in this very building. And while playing the game, I created a map. So this is a map of the whole game. There are a few interesting puzzles. There's a lot of details. So there's a rug in the hallway, and you can look at the rug and you can see who made the rug and what was the price of the rug and all these details about kind of everyday life objects. You can also go to Demon's office. And this is a photo that was provided to me by Martin Malý. So this is what Demon's office looked like. It's not as amazing as it sounds. So now kind of moving on a little bit towards the more kind of political games, I want to talk about Stodman. Stodman is a game that was made in the 90s, but it very much continues in the tradition of hyperlocal games. It takes place in the town of Stod, which is close to Pilsen, and more specifically in the high school in that town. And now I want to play a video for you of the author explaining what the game is about.
Stodman jako postava je hrdina. Tady je dobrý zmínit, že jsem se s tou postavou ne úplně na začátku, ale někdy během vymýšlení hry identifikoval. Takže jde vlastně o mě. Respektman byl Pája Korbel. Hlavní hrdina Stodman se dostane do školní budovy, zapadnou za ním dveře, zamknou se. V té školní budově musí získat materiály z výslechů Stodmana a Respektmana a tyto materiály v příslušné datové podobě poslat tajné organizaci, která zajistí chycení a potrestání příslušných viníků. A posledním úkolem je uniknout z budovy školy. Stodman měl svůj image. Charakterizovali ho tmavý brejle, opět 80. léta, klasický kulatý brejle, koženková nebo kožená bunda, kalhoty, klasika rifle, co se tenkrát nosilo, obuš byl Stodman zobrazovaný ve výkopu a la Van Damme, prostě tu jednu nohu nahoře nad hlavou a s roztočeným respektem. Malý Jan, dokud je malej, potřebuje chránit. Potřebuje nějakou berličku nebo nějakou posilu. Takže tohle, to, co vidíte, je fantazie. Na druhou stranu tuhle bundu jsem nosil skutečně, podobný brejle jsem nosil skutečně, nikoliv jako ochranu fyzickou, ale jako spíš způsob psychického zastrašování. Pixla zakomplexovaná byla výchovná poradkyně, skutečný jméno Ivanka Nosková. Přestože zní takhle roztomilé, tak ta paní měla na svědomí mě takhle s tím pájou, jak se pokusila nás, jak řekněme, dostat do spárů psychiatra. Vždycky si z ročníku někoho vyhlídla, přesvědčila ho nebo ho uvrtala do nějakého problému a pak ho posílala do poradny do Havlovic.
Okay, so this is a really interesting example. The game, there's a lot of mundane things about the game. So it traces basically the way from the train station to the school, and then it takes place in the school where you have to do these covert operations. So there's something very mundane about it, but it's also a pretty humorous game, I must say, and well designed. But now we also know that the game was pretty much an immediate reaction to the abuse that these two kids were getting from the school's staff and the counselor. And the game allowed them to relive these situations, but from the position of empowerment. Like now they were the superheroes who were returning to the school to take basically revenge or to kind of set things right in this particular school. As Jan Lonsky put it in an interview, we weren't weak. We had our own powers and abilities. One of them was the ability to express ourselves in a way that cannot be intercepted by them. And by them, he means the authorities. So for them, games were empowering, and digital media were empowering. They were means of personal and artistic expression, and they were also political in the sense that they kind of addressed the distribution and legitimacy of power and the abuse of power. And this way, I think we can get to games that are explicitly about political topics. So games about political issues are now pretty common. When you read accounts of these games in literature, they usually give examples that are from the 2000s. So September 12th is this really interesting pacifist anti-war game made in the aftermath of 9/11, and it's this textbook example of a political game. Raid Gaza, another one from 2008, a really interesting game about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we can go much further back in the history to the 1980s in Czechoslovakia. So what was happening in the country in the late 1980s? So following the reforms in the Soviet Union, perestroika and glasnost and all these things that Gorbachev introduced, the atmosphere was becoming a bit more liberal in Czechoslovakia, as it was, in Poland, I believe. But there were some kind of concessions to freedom of speech and so on, but they were very small changes. So they didn't really appease the population. Instead, it made the population less afraid to voice their opinions and to protest. So in 1988 started a series of demonstrations against the communist regime, and one of the I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, a series of demonstrations. The first of them happened in 1988. First of them happened in 1988. And also the earliest preserved, probably, the earliest preserved political game from Czechoslovakia is also from 1988. So people were using all kinds of media to, spread the message of protest. Computer games were probably not the main one. I mean, they were surely not the main one. There was samizdat, amateur publishing, word of mouth, basically, and all kinds of things. But computer games as well. And computer games had this advantage. The advantage of the fact that nobody really believed that they were media. They were probably the least regulated medium in the country because the authorities just didn't have the slightest idea that they could deliver political messages. So this series of games appeared. First of them, Reconstruction, or Perestroika, or Přestavba. It's a game that takes place in this anonymous town, an anonymous Czech town, and the goal of the game is to destroy the statue of Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who was kind of this icon of the obsolete communist regime. It's a pretty funny game as well. It's very satirical. There's one particular joke that I like about it. So to light up your way through a dark tunnel, you have to set ablaze a copy of Marx's Capital, the book. And it's a pretty thick book, so it can last for quite long. There's another interesting joke in the game. So there's this, to light up the Capital, you have to use a lighter, but the lighter is of Soviet, produced in the Soviet Union. And I think Czechoslovaks weren't really convinced about the quality of Soviet products, so the lighter only works in 1/3 of the cases. So if you're unlucky, you might think that the game is broken, but it's not the game that is broken, it's the lighter that is broken, and you have to try repeatedly. But the most important part of the game is actually its ending. So when you get to the end, you get this screen which says, "Congratulations once more. We will all meet on August 21st on Old Town Square or anywhere else." And August 21st, 1988 was the 20th anniversary of the occupation of Czechoslovakia by Soviets, by the Allied forces of the Warsaw Pact. And that was also one of the first major demonstrations. Most of these political games were released anonymously, so we don't know their authors. This is an exception. We know that it was made by Miroslav Fiedler, who was one of the country's top 8-bit coders. He was 18 at that time, yeah. And he says, "I was so ingenious that in order for the secret police not to catch me, I made the game awfully primitive." And this is kind of commenting on the other games that he made. His games were usually very sophisticated, written in machine code and with lots of graphics and animation. But he made this game primitive so that he wasn't caught by the secret police. So he kind of gave up the bling and went for the message. It was a naive protest of sorts. So, he didn't actually himself go to the demonstrations, but he was disillusioned with, with the developments in the country and just wanted to express his opinions. The next big series of demonstrations happened in January 1989, and it is called Palach Week. It was a commemoration of the anniversary of self-immolation of Jan Palach, who did it in 1969 to protest the developments in the country. And hundreds of people gathered on Wenceslas Square, the biggest boulevard in Prague, to protest. Many of them were students, but these protests were brutally suppressed by the police. Very brutally, and it was kind of the start of the erosion of legitimacy, or maybe the last drop to maybe the before last drop, before the legitimacy of the communist regime was just completely destroyed. So people were really angry about this, and there was a game made about these demonstrations called The Adventures of Indiana Jones, on Wenceslas Square in Prague on January 16th, 1989. So in this game, you play the role of Indiana Jones, a very popular computer game character, who is trapped on Wenceslas Square and has to make his way to the airport to flee to the United States. It's a very violent game. So there are a lot of death scenes. So you die a lot, and other characters die a lot too. It's satirical, but at the same time, it has this like really kind of bitter humor about it. So I theorize, and I cannot really prove it. I theorize that the person who made the game was actually there, because it's very realistic in a way. You really feel like you're on Wenceslas Square with all the water cannons and police beating people up. This is one of the death scenes. You're standing at an unobstructed entrance into the subway. As soon as you showed up, an officer came to you and searched you. Having found nothing, he called on his comrades, and they beat you senseless. As they were running away to deal with some woman with a baby carriage, one of them lost a machete. You crawled for it and committed harakiri. Indiana Jones is dead. And another, more successful scene. You're standing in front of the grocery house department store. The entrance into the subway is fortunately clear. An annoying man, probably a communist, is looking out of a balcony and happily watching the good work of the members of the public security, which was the sort of euphemism for the police back then, the official euphemism for police. You can go down to the right or inside. You see a cop, and I had picked up an axe before. Use axe. You drove your axe so deep inside his skull that it cannot be pulled out. You see a dead cop. So you dispose of the members of the police in this very brutal manner. So once again, we can see that the game is used as a stage where the player can sort of relive a traumatic experience. It's also, it's obviously political, but using this character of Indiana Jones and putting him into the shoes of protesters, I think, is kind of this interesting kind of performance of, the role of the protester. So as Indiana Jones, you would imagine that you're like this super kind of strong character with like all kinds of weapons at your disposal. Not really. You basically use what you find on the spot. Axe, okay, but you're throwing, bricks. There is a gun in the game that you can pick up, but you can never fire it. You don't use the weapons of the oppressors. You use the weapons of the street, which I think, I'm not sure if this was like intentional strategy of the author, but I think it works very well. After this one, the next major demonstration was the one on the 17th of November in 1989, and as you know, it marked the beginning of the Velvet Revolution. So that was when the legitimacy of the regime finally was torn down. There were games being made about these events as well. Here you can see one of the iconic photographs from the protests, November protests, and the famous slogan, "We don't want violence." So this is a game that was, if we are to believe the loading screen of the game, it was made just 2 days after the demonstration, at a point where nobody really knew what would happen. Nobody really knew that the communists would go away. It was a very tense time and a very dramatic time. So they made a game about this particular protest, and they used the very same slogan. So if we go back to what Anthropy said about the topics that we can use to make games, we can see that people really use them for self-expression. They were zinesters. So she uses this word zinester, and these games for those people were samizdat. They were their fanzines. They were their zines. They were the means of expression that was available to them. Most of them were young guys who knew how to program and what else to use for this to express their opinions than a computer game. So we're getting towards the end now, and it's just like we have a bit of time to reflect on these stories. So one kind of way of thinking about it is to say, yeah, Czechoslovaks were so inventive and so exceptional. I don't want to say this. Games like this have not really been documented anywhere else, but I think it's just a matter of the historical work not being there, the research not being done. I think similar games were made in Poland. I haven't seen a particular example, but it's likely, and I'd love to see the examples. And I'm also not a nationalist, so I think that this is not the argument I want to make. More than that, I want to kind of return to the point about games having always been indie. This kind of return to this kind of open-ended, open-minded thinking about games, not being constrained by some artificial, conventional boundaries of what is a good topic for a game and what's not. I've been asked this question. So I'm saying, how games were used in these interesting ways under the communist regime. So do I think that the communist regime is a good model for a society? Not at all. I don't think that at all. I think that what happened in the 1980s Czechoslovakia is more of like an interesting analytical case, as I said, like a laboratory or a reservation, where things unfolded a bit differently. So these amateur games made by enthusiasts, these hyperlocal games and activist games are much more visible than they would have been, in the UK, for instance, or in Germany, or in the United States, where they would have been overshadowed by the commercial production. So looking at games in Czechoslovakia kind of makes us see this very clearly. And my last point, the topic of this conference is system boundaries, and we have seen that methodologically it makes a lot of sense to look beyond the common boundaries. So look at the history of games not only in Japan and not only write about Pac-Man and and Mario, but also look beyond those boundaries. There might be interesting stuff happening there. And at the same time, for designers and artists who work with digital media, I want to suggest that they look, beyond the boundaries of what's common industry practice to try to explore, digital media as acts of personal expression and activism. Thank you.